Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience. Mary took a deep breath and was about to knock on the door of her boss's office. But when she listened, she froze. Georg Duzman was clearly not in the mood. She could tell by the irritable tone in which he was speaking to the visitor. The young man, could barely contain eating so as not to turn to shouting, he explained. The agency is a holiday, not an ex-service. I don't have a girl who's right for you. Yes, you misunderstood me. The customer started to make excuses. I don't care what you wanted, Georg Duzman interrupted him. The door's right behind you. I won't keep you. I'll pay you well. Pulled the nail out of the last trump. There was silence in the office. Mary smiled. What a bug my boss is. When it comes to money, he's all over the place. But suddenly she heard something that surprised her. No. And that was my final answer. There was no point in waiting any longer. If Georg Duzman refused the money, there was no chance of obtaining his consent to anything else from the visitor. She knew that very well. So immediately, in those seconds, the girl knocked loudly at the door and, without waiting for an invitation, opened it. Suddenly, she came face to face with the very visitor who a second earlier had tried to talk her boss into something. She noted that the man was visibly upset. What did you want, Mary? A loud voice from her boss brought her out of her musings. Georg Duzman, can I be gone for an hour? I'm going to the nursery to get the baby back and forth. He's been making a bit of a nuisance of himself. Go, he waved his hand. I don't have any orders for today. You don't have to come back today, but tomorrow you're due at 800. Mary quickly shut the door behind her, on which a gold sign read above. The director of the Georg Duzman Holiday Agency. The first time she heard her boss's last name, she was surprised by such irony. But then everyone got used to it. On the way to the staff room, she dialed a cab number and ordered a car. Quickly dressed, the girl jumped out and saw a white foreign car standing at the entrance, sat in it. She dictated to the driver without even looking at him. He answered well, and the car started moving. Suddenly the phone rang, and she answered it with the disgruntled voice of a man who asked when she planned to get out. It was the cab driver, who did not understand anything, and the girl looked at the driver and gasped. In the rearview mirror, the same man she had recently bumped into in her boss's office was looking at her, smiling, but I muttered. She piped up. Anyway, I'm sorry, I changed my mind. I quickly found something to answer. The girl turned off the phone. How did this happen? She turned to the driver. Why didn't you tell her I was in the wrong car? I do not know, the stranger shrugged. I heard that you were called to the kindergarten. Then you are in a hurry. So I thought I'd help you. But you're strange, grinned the girl. By the way, my name is Mary. Dan, the driver smiled. And if it is not a secret, Magoo could not refrain her curiosity. What did you come to see my boss about? I just happened to overhear part of your conversation. Unless, of course, it's some kind of secret. Mary rolled her eyes expressively. I won't be offended if you don't tell me. No, there's no mystery about it. I just want a girl to play the bride. That's all. Mary was clearly disappointed. What else do you want? Dan smiled. His eyes remained sad. You see, in 2 days to come to my parents, who want to meet the girl, youngest son, except that there is no girl, and where to get her on such short notice. I don't know. Well, don't you know any girls? Magoo was sincerely surprised. But as it happens, no, Dan sighed. I parked in front of the kindergarten. Magoo, we have arrived. It was very nice to meet you and me, too, she smiled as she got out of the car. Thank you for the ride. How much do I owe you? Yes, nothing. He waved his hand. But Mary didn't hear him. She ran toward the garden, deftly maneuvering between passersby and her high heels across the observations and sidewalks. The guy looked in the trail of this strange girl and was about to drive away from the garden. How did his phone ring? It was a work call, and Dan had to explain for a long time where the necessary papers were. And then as much to find out why these papers. During the conversation, it turned out that the documents were needed quite different, and they were lying not at Dan's office, but at the head. The conversation took a long time. And when the man finally finished it, dropping the hot tube on the passenger seat, he saw Magoo dragging by the hand a boy with a very strange face. On some strange impulse, the boy opened the door of his car and shouted to Magoo, "Come on, I'll take you home." The girl was taken aback, but did not refuse. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked an astounded Magoo. "Yes, I was about to, but I noticed you on the phone and had a long chat." "You know," explained the guy, trying to look at her son through the rearview mirror. Dan was very curious about the boy's face. Unable to stand it, he asked, "What about him? Today we are the Spider-Man." With a strange intonation, the girl spoke with a squint, looking at the child. At quiet time, the teacher thought they were all fast asleep, so it happened. I do not know how much to say that a couple of minutes, but for these few minutes Sam managed to find a black marker on the table and covered not only his face and hands, but also two of his friends with cobwebs. The handsome man chuckled, finally getting a look at his little passenger's face. "What's so scary about that?" he asked, turning back to Mary. "Well, I agree. The lines aren't very straight, of course. But it's a matter of practice," he laughed. But catching a frown of the girl, silenced and started the car. "Marker does not wash off, and tomorrow morning, it's hard," Magoo sighed. "Sam, strange as it sounds, will be a bear and a mask tomorrow. And here are the girls who got hit by snowflakes, and I'd hate to meet their moms." Dan, barely able to keep from laughing and thereby incurring the righteous wrath of his new acquaintance, drove out of the parking lot. He had no children yet, but from his point of view, the situation was more comical than tragic. "Tell me the address," he asked, and when he heard the answer, he looked at Mary in surprise. "Yes, we are almost neighbors. I live 3 doors away. It is strange that I have never met you." They spent the rest of the trip in silence as the car pulled up in front of the driveway. Magoo said, "Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Can you tell me how much I owe you? It's kind of embarrassing. You drove me so much, and all for free." "I do not take money," the guy smiled. But catching in the mirror a dumbfounded look, Mary hastened to explain. "But from tea and candy, I would not refuse." The girl sighed in relief. She got the hint. "I have plenty of tea." Candy, however, ran out at the start. "So let's go drink tea." Great smile done, putting the car alarm, and her husband will not mind. "He won't," smiled the girl. Sitting in the cozy kitchen, Dan watched as Mary put the kettle on and took the cake out of the fridge. Sam sat next to her, prepared a large spoon and his favorite mug. Dan realized this because there was a picture of a Spider-Man on the lid. As he looked at the child's face, the man once again could not hold back a smile. It was so adorable. Mary, meeting her guest's eyes, also smiled. She was no longer angry with her son. After all, there was no point in it anyway, and the situation was indeed amusing. If you look at it from a slightly different angle, the hostess sat down at the table. "What do you do for a living, Mary?" Dan asked. For some reason, he wanted to know as much as he could about her. "I am an accountant, but it's only in the papers. And if necessary, I can also be a cleaner and a secretary and even an animator, if any of the girls are sick." "Private office." The girl shrugged her shoulders and carefully broke off a piece of cake with her spoon. "As Matvey Anatolievich likes to say, we have a pond of them outside the gates. Don't you want to work? Write your application. There's always a place for nothing. I must say, he pays well and on time." That's why we tolerate it. Sam and I don't need much. We have a job we can get out of if we need it urgently, and we get paid on time. It is hard to find one these days. What about your husband? Doesn't he give you any money? He was sincerely surprised. There is no husband, laughed the girl. Sam and I live together. And what will you do now? Mary changed the subject of the conversation. Tell your parents that there is no bride. The young man sighed. He did not know how to explain it, and little familiar beauty that his parents are good. But it is very exciting in the absence of his youngest son's fiancée madly alarming them. The problem is that if I tell my mother that I still do not have a bride, she will bring me to see her friend's daughter. And this daughter, how can I put it gently, is not really my option. And Dan sighed again, remembering the twig his mother is so actively trying to dedicate to him. How messed up everything is. Trying not to laugh, Magoo muttered. For some reason, she was very amused by the situation. She had never expected that such an attractive and manly man as her new acquaintance could not explain to her mother that he did not have a fiancé and was not yet ready for a family relationship. Don't laugh, muttered Dan. You just don't know my mother. Well, yes, nodded to Meg. And then she said, and you happily offered big money. You wouldn't believe this one would rather turn down an opportunity to make money. I did, but he did not even ask. He was silent for a while, and then he still refused, he said, quickly retold Mary his conversation with her boss. Scared, Mary concluded, and noticing Dan's uncomprehending look, explained that you were afraid of the competition. He's more afraid of them than anything else. Oh, well, that's all right. Tell me this, what will your fiancé have to do? There's no need for intimacy. Your mother won't stand in the bedroom with a candle and check on the seriousness of your relationship, trying to keep a serious expression on her face. Are you kidding me? Of course she won't. Legend has it that Lucy and I do not live together. With whom? Clarified Mary, who was already confused about this story with Lucy. Lucy, that is the name of my fiancé, the man answered fictitiously. And clearly she stretched out and then quickly added, Dan, you leave me your phone number. I'll think, how can I help you? You have helped me out several times today. Now it's my turn. Of course, I can't promise anything, but I'll try to persuade my friend. And I'll call you tonight, okay? Yes, of course, rejoiced, muttered the guy, who no longer believed that he could solve his problem. When he left, she dialed the number of her friend, briefly outlined the situation. Christine agreed. You do not need the money? The man is handsome, at first glance not harmful. The car is cool, so you can also make money, she persuaded. Mary, I do not understand you. You are so actively promoting this man to me. So much dignity painted. Then, why don't you want to help him? Play the part of his bride. You could make some money too. You and Sam will not be redundant. Christine thought about it. Yes, where did Mary, who for some reason really wanted to play the role of Dan's bride, but was afraid. Fear was present, probably also because she liked the man. There was something about him that made a girl's heart sink. What? Where? She didn't understand her friend. Damn, Christine, I can't. I have no one to leave Sam with. Slightly lying girl. A go with a child on a case. I cannot do either. This Dan's mom, as I understand it, is a strange woman. It is unlikely to please her daughter-in-law with a child. Why don't you go and see if you can work something out with him? He's a free man. And you're a pretty one, aren't you? Mary said into the phone. No, I just made up with Jean. I can't. Hearing this, Mary sighed. She knew that Christina loved her good, for nothing John very much. Only their relationship is strange. It was peace, then shouting, then fighting. Now they are again in a period of truce, which means that persuading her to help Dan is useless. It's a pity, Magoo stretched out. But I'm glad that you two have reconciled. It's just a pity about Dan. I was so hoping that you would agree, and we could help him. So help yourself. Chrissy Dean almost screamed. But I can't. I told you. It's not an explanation, it's an excuse. In a voice which could not be objected to, said her friend. Sam, take her to her grandmother. She will not refuse. You go back to your Dan. I can't go to her. She's got things to do. Mary lied to me. What's that old hockey stick up to? Kristen, who couldn't stand Aunt Ross, asked her rudely, and Aunt Ross reciprocated. Kristen, well, I don't know. But after all, she doesn't have to report to me. Held out to Meg. When do you have to? In 2 days, suddenly specified Chris, rustling something, and after a little silence she said, Aren't you the lucky one? Sean will be back from his shift in 2 days. It's my day off, too. We'll take your Sam to our place. You know he loves Sean. Let him play. The boy needs a man's company. When Mary heard the last phrase, she tried not to cry out loud. Everybody had been trying to rub her nose in the phrase about the importance of men's company for her son lately, and where to get that society. Mary didn't know. All right, she replied, and hung up. Sam's father had never seen his son once in his life. Magoo had a brief affair with the man. The girl first lost her head and fell in love without memory. She was 19 years old at the time. She was a student at a pedagogical university. Her family, she lived in the middle income. Not poor, but they did not have extra money. That is why the girl did not refuse to work. And now, before the next vacation, her friend offered her a job as a counselor at a children's camp. And why not? She thought then Mary. Especially the camp, not God knows what, but at sea. The proposal really interested her. 2 months at sea. She loves children, and everything seems to be in her profession. She will also receive a salary. In general, without hesitation, the girl agreed. To collect all the necessary certificates and documents, she had to run a lot. With all that fuss, Mary did not notice how the time of departure approached. The girl was very nervous. It was her first serious job. For 20, 0 in the train, and her thoughts came to order. And there it was, the sea. Deeply inhaled the air. Mary entered the gate of the pioneer camp. She was greeted by a friendly guard. She was even surprised at this welcome. Usually guards are not the friendliest people, she thought to herself. He took her to the camp director and the head counselor, and the head counselor, and the head counselor charged her for the linens. And so when this circle was over, Mary was shown her room. She was very tired from the road and difficult to perceive the large volume of information bombarding her. So she asked to let her rest. All right, rest. Tomorrow's meeting is at 9:00 a.m. Don't be late. Before the first run, you need to be properly prepared. The senior counselor warned her. Mary only had to lay her head on the pillow, and she immediately fell into a deep sleep. Wake her up only the alarm clock set for 8:00. She washed her face, did her hair and makeup, to be fully prepared. After all, as she thought, all only at her and Will look. There were a lot of people at the meeting in the assembly hall. There were janitors, cooks, and counselors. But in general, all the staff all listened to safety techniques, the plan of actions, and everything that concerned their duties. It seemed nothing complicated. Then the counselors were divided into 3 persons per group. The senior ones were those who were already experienced in this business. Mary was assigned to Nicole and Polo. She was surprised that the boys were going for such a job. But, as it turned out later, and Paul had not come here the first time, accordingly, he was put in charge. And Nicole, just like Mary, decided to try her hand at it for the first time. By the way, Mary didn't like her very much. She did not seem to know him yet, but that is the case when you look at a person and you do not like something in him. Paul, on the other hand, was handsome, Mary noted. And so the day's work began. In the evening, Mary was off her feet. They had 8-year-old children to look after. They needed an eye on them. They scattered like ants around the camp, so day after day flew by. By the end of the first week, things had settled down a bit. The children were in a group of their own interests, and it was time for a little rest. Then Mary remembered that Paul was cute, but he didn't pay any attention to her. He turned out to be the kind of man who gave himself completely to his work. His whole day was spent with the children. They came up with activities together: volleyball, basketball, competition. All in all, the squad was lucky with the counselors, and Mary with Nicole, a colleague. At one point, watching how easy he was to get along with the kids, Mary even caught herself thinking that another checkmark had been added to her list of Paul's characteristics, and he probably wouldn't be a bad father to his children. As time went on, the job turned out to be quite interesting. Mary decided to come here again next year, especially since Paula had the same attitude. The girl did not notice how she became attached to him. It is possible even to tell that she not just got attached, but got knocked up. Saul had also changed his mood towards her by the end of the shift, and now they could have long conversations after lights out. Mary was interested in him. He was very well read, knew a lot of interesting stories. All in all, he was an enviable conversationalist. The girl just sat and listened. It seemed to her that against his background she was an uneducated schoolgirl. And so one such evening, during another story, Paul incautiously embraced Mary. She did not resist. She put her head on his shoulder. When he realized that she was in his good graces, the young man kissed her, and Mary reciprocated. From there it was all like in an adult movie. Enthralled by love, Mary went to her room. Only in the morning her legs were cotton with happiness. She could not imagine how she would work today. After all her thoughts were only of him. I must be in love. The thought screamed in her head, but the happiness did not last long. It was an ordinary morning for everyone: exercise, breakfast, preparing for the day, farewell to camp. We were days away from leaving. Paul, for some reason, began to avoid it. He was very busy in the evenings. Something was amiss, Mary thought, and decided to have a serious talk with her lover. She chose an opportune moment during the filming. "Paul, what is going on? Why are you avoiding me?" she asked. "It's okay, you seem dry," he answered. "And I don't like this conversation at all. And what about all the things we had?" she asked, trying to hold back her tears. "And what was there between us without taking it so seriously? The sea, the sun. You and I relaxed a little. That's what happens with adults." "Forget it," the guy replied, and not a muscle trembled on his face. "Relaxed. That's what they call it now. I'm not some slutty girl. It's all serious to me," Mary burst into tears. "Don't start." But it was, and it was. "I don't want to continue this useless conversation anymore," nervously answered Paul. He got up and left. Mary was left alone with her thoughts. How hard was it for her at that moment? She really wanted to go home. A cat squeaked in her soul. But where to go? Need to finish the job. She mustered all her strength and plunged headlong into her work. A few days went by and Paul, too, paid no attention to Mary and pretended that nothing had happened. She, too, tried her best to control herself. She decided not to impose, even though it wasn't easy. A few days before her departure, Mary shared her feelings with Nicole over a cup of tea. She had worked as a cook at this camp for several years and knew Paula well, or rather about his adventures. It was a shock to Magoo. It turns out that it was his hobby to sleep with young counselors, and it was important that it be before he left so that no one would blow his mind. They're gone. No answer, no hello. Mary was offended to hear this and very unhappy to be added to this list. She decided to forget it all and move on. Then came the day of departure. The girl was sad to say goodbye to her children. Yes, her own. She was so fond of them. But everything comes to an end. She was a different person on the train. It seemed to her that she had become an adult, rethinking a lot of things in life. And the bitter experience with Paulum was a credit to that. Life spun into its usual rhythm. Studying again, Mary began to forget the whole unpleasant story. She could not have imagined that this story was just beginning and would prove to be such an ordeal for her. One day, at a lecture, she felt sick and dizzy. They let her go home. Mary chalked it all up to ordinary fatigue. The thought of pregnancy she could not even allow. Then it happened all over again. She took a test and almost fainted at the result. 2 lines. How could it be? Maybe it's a mistake. I don't even have a boyfriend. But then she figured it out. Paul. It was the only way. But how come? It was a one-time thing. God, but why was I so careless? How do I tell my parents about this? What to do next? Thoughts rushed through one by one. Mary was confused and couldn't get her thoughts together to figure out what to do about it next. Several days passed. She was not herself at ease. She did not say anything to her parents. She only told her best friend, Kristen. It was Christine who persuaded her to write to Paulu. Though Mary did not agree for a long time. She was proud and stubborn. Why should she tell him? It was a passing fancy. I don't know anything about it. I don't even know what town he lives in. And here you are, showing up out of the blue. It's your kid. Take this, sign it. The girl resented it, but she got over herself and wrote him on social media. I'm expecting a baby. The answer came the next day. I don't know anything. That's your problem. If you slept with me so easily. Maybe you have crowds like me out there. Don't ever write to me again. Of course, Mary was hurt to hear such words. But she didn't object and make excuses for herself. She understood that it was only her problem, and she did not write and impose herself again. To Meg's surprise, her mother reacted very calmly. Of course, no one knows what was going on in her soul at that moment. We will have a baby, my mother said firmly. And it is not a question of discussion. You can do it, and I will help. The time passed. Mary gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. She didn't take a sabbatical. It so happened that the birth came at the end of the school year. She had to take her exams a little later than others. But the girl coped with it all. Her mother was a huge help, and she had just retired. Mary never once regretted having the baby. Paul never showed up. Yes, they didn't need him at all. The only thing that bothered the girl was that now she would probably be alone all her life. She tried to come to terms with it. But like all women, she wanted someone to hold her, to kiss her. Especially at such a young age. Thoughts of her personal life had to be put on hold indefinitely. A great grief came to the family. Meg's mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. It was a shock for the girl and her whole family. What to do next with a toddler in her arms and a sick mother? The father wasn't much of a pillar in their family. He worked, of course, but he drank all his free time. And he did not need an excuse. For this mother rapidly began to decline. From a recently cheerful, active woman, she turned into a sickly, nursing old woman. The hard times in Meg's life began with a small child, a sick mother, and a drinking father. There was no help from anywhere. They could barely make ends meet. The father also began to drink more and more often. 6 months later, her mother was gone. There was an emptiness in the girl's soul, as if a part of her had died along with the person she loved. The only comfort she saw in her son, who was growing up carefree, unaware of his mother's problems. It was necessary to learn, to live a new life. And Mary pulled herself together again. Several years passed. She graduated from college, her son went to kindergarten, and Mary got a job teaching in a school. But after working there for a year, she quit because with all the notebook reports, Olympiads, and everything else, she just didn't have time for her beloved son. The girl graduated from accounting courses, got another job. And it was here that fate bumped her into Dan. Do you understand everything? Any questions? Looking at Mary asked an excited Dan. He was very much afraid that the whole play he had planned to play for his parents would fail, and then he would be in trouble. Mom would then have a scandal with a fainting spell and a doctor's call. Dad will sigh and say that he didn't bring up his son that way, that a man should be responsible for his actions and not lie. That was different in their day. Kids were more responsible. Then they'd tell his older brother, and he'd remember his failure with the phony bride for a long time to come. Dan noisily sucked in air and looked at Mary, looking for support. The girl looked up at Dan with her beautiful eyes. Slowly and clearly she spoke. My name is Lucy. I am 25 years old. I work with you in the same firm. I am a translator. By the way, no one wants to test my language skills, Magoo asked anxiously. No, but I hope not, Dan muttered thoughtfully, and then added, no, definitely no one will test. Mom is not good with languages. Dad isn't either, and my brother can be clever, of course, but he won't come. He's got a pregnant wife. Anyway, don't worry. Mary sighed with relief and went on talking. Your mother's name is Melcida Williams. Your father's name is George Russell. That's right, Dan nodded. What's a topic you shouldn't talk to my mom about? On the subject of cooking. Magoo answered. Your mother really likes cooking. That means that any mention of a recipe is perceived as a call to action. Good for you. He smiled and then glanced at his watch and quickly added, you can talk to your dad about anything. Just don't argue. Don't say anything at all. I got it willingly. And I nodded at Meg. Good, they'll be here any minute. So let's calm down and tune in. I wish you good luck. Good luck, Magoo echoed her reply. Deep down, she was already regretting getting involved in this adventure. But on the other hand, she realized that she was not doing it for the money Dan had promised her, but because she really liked the man. Also, this young man fell in love with her son. The boy had already asked Magoo several times when Uncle Dan, the one who had given them a ride in the cool car, would come to visit them again. Baby, he's not coming again, Mary said, stroking his son's head. That uncle just gave us a ride. That's all. That's a pity. And I wish I had such a father, the boy said dreamily, closing his eyes. I completely forgot about the champagne, Dan exclaimed. I'll go get it from the fridge. Meanwhile, you sit down and take a breath. Try to calm down. Your hands are shaking. Dan smiled and went into the kitchen. As soon as the man had gone, the doorbell rang. Mary, open up, he shouted from the kitchen. I'll be right there. She went to the front door and swung it open, sighing deeply, as if she were about to jump into the water. It was pitch black on the landing, and she couldn't quite see who was standing on the threshold. Mary looked more closely and saw a tall man. She couldn't see his face. He was standing sideways, holding something behind him. Mary assumed that it was the father of Dan George Russell, so she said loudly, Hello, George. My name is Lucy. I am your son's girlfriend, but you can just call me Lisi. I am your son's girlfriend, but you can just call me Lisi. Please come in, Dan. We'll be right out. Where? She didn't have time to finish, and the man, who was still stomping on the threshold of the apartment, suddenly turned to face the girl, and she realized that it was not Dan's father. The young man was standing in front of her. My name is Paul. I am the brother of Dan. At that moment, Mary was able to see his face. and the ground slowly began to fall away from under her feet, grabbing the door with both hands. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again. Unable to cope with the shock, Meg exclaimed. "You?" Paul frowned, scrutinizing the face of the young woman standing on the threshold, and then cursed guiltily and whistled softly. "Why, what?" "It can't be. This is my fiancée," Dan muttered, appearing behind Magoo's back. "Didn't she tell you?" "Her name is Lucy." "What brings you here?" "Where are Mommy and Daddy?" Looking at his brother, the man asked. Mary stood undead the whole time, not knowing what to do or how to behave. If before she had longed to see Paula and look him in the face for doing this to her, now she was simply divided. She knew that if she instantly made a show of herself, she would be setting Dan up, and she didn't want to make a fool of herself. She looked up at Paula, and when she met his eyes, she cringed inside. That look made her very afraid. He beckoned her to be quiet and spoke. "I'll tell you later how I got here. You'd better go downstairs to your parents. They are standing there with their suitcases. The elevator doesn't work as usual. I got my stuff, and you go get your parents' stuff." "Well, I'm going to rest for a while. I think your fiancé can pour me a glass of water. Lucy, you help Paulu. I'll go get my parents," Dan said, and quickly changed his slippers for his shoes, put on his jacket, and ran downstairs. Mary, keeping her eyes on Paula, who was licking his parched and dry lips. Sighing heavily, the girl was about to start a conversation, but the man beat her to it. He slammed the front door shut. He came close to her and squeezed her between the clothes, rack and the wall, whispering hotly in her ear, "I don't know what you're up to or why you called yourself Lucy, how you invaded my good brother's trust. But I will not allow you to deceive Dan. He is simple, of course, but he is my brother. I didn't mean to," she whispered softly to Magoo, who was shaking under Paula's pressure. The girl had not expected such a twist of fate and was totally unprepared for it. Something was about to happen. "What did I understand?" "You somehow found out that Dan, my brother, you decided." Before he could continue his thought, footsteps and voices were heard on the stairs. By the time the door swung open, he had already bounced away from the girl, and she was still standing against the wall. She was standing against the wall, unable to move. "Oh, you're still standing there," said astonished Dan. "I thought you were sitting at the table. What is the matter with you? You look as if you've seen a ghost. Are you afraid of Paul or something?" "Don't be scared. He's normal," Dan kept talking. He pushed Mega away from the wall and gently nudged her toward the dining room. "Yeah, we were just chatting," looking at his brother cheerfully. "Paul said, asking your fiancée where you met. She told me in such a fascinating way that I listened to her. Lucy, tell me, where did you meet my son?" Paul and Dan's mother spoke. Melcida had already taken off her outer clothing and shoes and took Mary under her arm to lead her into the depths of the apartment. The girl did not resist and walked obediently, answering many questions at a loss. Dan was a little puzzled by the bride's condition and tried to understand what had happened to her, but the man did not have time to think about it fully. His brother and father were not far behind. They poured out to Dan with news for a minute, telling him how they had gotten there and what fools they had met along the way. Finally, they were all seated at the table. Dan could see that Mary was upset about something, so he whispered in her ear quietly, before anyone could hear, "What's wrong? Did someone hurt you?" "No, I'm fine." She smiled slightly at Magoo. Gradually, the atmosphere at the table was relaxed. Everyone laughed at Gorga's jokes. Mary answered Melcides' questions with ease, and as it seemed, relaxed a little. But she tried not to look at Pale. But he acted brazenly. He kept asking his brother's fiancée embarrassing questions, trying to get at her. Mary held her own. She didn't want to screw Dan, who she really liked. But Dan himself was getting angry. "Paul, I don't understand why you're picking on Lucy. If you didn't have a pregnant Alice, I'd think you liked my fiancée, said the brother. Why, maybe I didn't I? Smirked, having time to praise Paul. There was an awkward silence at the table. In order to somehow smooth out the awkwardness caused by the behavior of her eldest son, Melcida began to loudly tell stories from Dan's life. You know, Lucy, the woman looked at Mary confidentially. Dan, when he was little, well, Mom, it's not impolite. Paul interrupted his mother. At least you can tell me about Dan later. Let's find out more about Lucy. Lucy, tell me, why do you need our Dan? What do you see in him? Shush! Paul held up his hand, gesturing to his mother to be silent. And tell me, my dear Lucy, the name of the girl, the man said with particular sarcasm. Have you ever been married before? And do you have children? We need to know everything, or in whose caring hands we give our closest relative. Hearing the last phrases, Mary rose from her seat and quickly ran into the corridor. She could no longer endure Paul's bullying, though no, she could stand a lot of it. But when this man tried to pick on her as a child, she was in unbearable pain. The girl quickly tightened her jacket. Mary, as much as she wanted to button it, the tears that rolled down her cheeks in huge drops prevented her from getting into the lock properly. You jerk, Mary heard Dan's voice, and in a few seconds he was already standing beside her. Don't be offended by him. He's just drunk. I don't know what got into him. Don't go away, Dan said very quietly, looking at Mary. The girl did not look at Dan. She did not want him to see her tears. She did not want to explain, but Dan understood anyway. He came close to Mary and very gently took her by the chin and looked into her eyes. She did not break away. She lifted her head obediently and froze, looking at Dan. Obeying an inexplicable impulse, the man leaned forward and very gently touched his lips to hers. That innocent kiss stirred up a whole range of emotions in Dan's soul. It seemed to her as if some unknown strings inside her had burst, and all the tension she had been feeling lately was gone. All that remained was lightness and a sense of flight. Dan pulled away from Mary, but he was still standing too close. The girl could smell him, and goosebumps ran down her body. Don't go away, Dan spoke again. This time his voice sounded hoarse. And I'm sorry. It's not your fault. I have to go. Coming to her senses and trying not to shake her voice, said Mary. Tell your parents I'm sorry. They are wonderful. I like them very much. Tell them I don't feel well, so I decided to go away. I don't want to spoil your evening, and I've already played my part. Goodbye. She turned and hurriedly opened the door so as not to change her mind or make any mistake. I won't let you go alone. I'll tell your parents in a second, and then I'll show you out. Mary didn't want to argue and bent her forehead at the door and dutifully waited for Dan. The girl heard the man explaining something to her parents. She heard Melcida arguing about something, and then all the voices' poetry. Let's go, suddenly heard Mega. Dan's voice behind her, and turning around she saw that he was already alone. The young men went silently to the landing in the same silence and left the entrance. The man only spoke on the street. Shall we walk or call a cab? Looking at Mary, he asked, I can't drive. I've been drinking. Let's take a walk. I need some air. You're mad at my brother? Don't be. He's so crazy. Maybe he had too much to drink. Honestly, neither my parents nor I know what's gotten into him today. He's not making any sense. What kind of nonsense? Asked Mega. She felt as if her heart had stopped beating while she waited for an answer. She was very afraid that Paul had said mean things about her, even realizing that there was no future with Dan. She didn't want this man to think ill of her. She liked him too much. You see, when I left, Paul said you weren't who you said you were, Dan said thoughtfully. He sounded so sure, like he knew you weren't my fiancée. Like he knows who you are, and he does. Magoo spoke very quietly, and Dan, who was walking next to her, stopped. looking at the girl with surprised eyes. "How?" he asked. Mary was silent, and the man began to ask questions. "Why didn't you say you knew my brother from the start? Why was he silent? What happened between you two?" "Dan, calm down," Mary said, touching him lightly on the shoulder. "The history between me and Palom is not a very beautiful one. I think your brother doesn't want to tell it. And he's already regretted it 100 times that he came to see you and met me. If your dad's car hadn't broken down, he wouldn't have come. I'm right, aren't I?" Dan nodded, and Mary smiled sadly and continued. "You see, if he hadn't come, he wouldn't have found out who you were pretending to be your fiancé, and all the dirt wouldn't be coming out now." She was silent, gathering her thoughts, and Dan whispered, "But Paul could have pretended he didn't know you. You didn't throw punches at him, did you? Or did I miss something?" "No, I didn't. And I didn't throw myself at him. In fact, I went into a stupor when I saw him. I guess if Mel Gibson was standing on your doorstep, I'd be less surprised." "Why Mel Gibson?" suddenly interrupted the girl in surprise. "Well, because I like him," and his name came to mind. Mary answered sadly and smiled. "And that's not what the conversation is about right now. We should. Gibson will discuss it later. So explain to me, how do you know Paula? And you're saying maybe he'll tell you himself. I have a feeling that our versions will be different." Magoo stretched out. She did not want to go into details. She now realized how stupid she had been at the time. The thought of it made her break into a quick sweat. "And he would tell me everything, too. Believe me. But first I want to hear your version of what happened. Especially since, from what I understand, the story of your acquaintance is not so good." Mary lowered her eyes and took in more air in her lungs and squeezed her eyes shut and spoke quickly. "Paul Sam's father." She stood there with her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for Dan's answer. But there was silence in response. Opening one eye, she saw the dumbfounded face of the guy. It was all he could ask. Dan's throat was dry with shock. Blood rushed to her face in a huge wave and pounded frantically in her temples. He came close to her and spoke. "Say what you just said one more time, very slowly." "Paul, my son's father," Mary spoke slowly. "Now tell me, where, when, and under what circumstances did all this happen?" he demanded of Magoo, grabbing her by the arm. "I must know everything. Why don't you ask your brother?" Mary answered, but seeing the man's frown, she bit her tongue as well. "The camp is summer. I got a job there as a counselor for the summertime, and he was already, in my opinion, the second or third summer. That's where we met. Your brother was like an impregnable wall, and I fell in love like a cat. I couldn't imagine life without him. I thought he was the most beautiful man in the world, and when he reciprocated my feelings, it was like an explosion. You can't even imagine. I just didn't know then that your brother acted according to a well-established plan. He'd pick his victim throughout the shift. He'd brainwash her. Then towards the end, he'd get her into bed. The shift ended. Everyone ran off to different cities, and that was it. So I got caught in the bait." Mary was silent for a while, and then questioned Dan. "Then what happened?" "Then I came home, and a couple of months later I realized I was pregnant." "Did you let him know you were pregnant, or did he find out how?" "Yes, of course he did. At first I tried to call him," I explained to Mary, "but his phone wasn't available. Then my friend Christine and I found him on social media, and I texted him there. But he said that it was my problem, and she also became silent. She doesn't know if she should continue." "What else?" Dan looked at her intently, waiting for an answer. "He also said that he wasn't sure it was his child. Like Russia agreed to sleep with him so quickly. There's no telling how many more I've had." She looked at him with tear-filled eyes, searching for support in him. "Are you sure it's his baby?" he asked, and he immediately regretted the question. Mary's behavior changed. She turned pale, and with a wicked grimace slapped him across the face. Quietly she whispered, "Male solidarity at its best. If you think your brother's white and fluffy, so be it. I'm not imposing anything on anyone, and I'm sorry I ever ran into you that day and agreed to help." After saying that, Mary turned around and walked quickly toward the driveway. "Oh, wait, that's not what I meant." "Sorry," shouted Dan. The girl couldn't hear him anymore, slamming the door loudly at the entryway. As she made her way to her apartment, she went home and closed the door and sank to the floor. She sobbed, sobbing as loudly and desperately as she'd probably never cried in her life. She needed to vent all the pain and resentment she had awakened when she saw Dan. Dan came home, not noticing anything around him. He blamed himself for hurting Mary with his words. The man also tried to tune in to talk to his brother. That there would be a conversation he didn't even doubt, knowing that he couldn't go on living normally without finding out that very truth. It was quiet at home. My father had gone to rest. Mom had cleared the table and was watching TV. "Where is Paul?" Dan asked me from the doorstep. "Is he lying down?" Mother nodded silently and then asked. "Lucy was very upset with us." "What have you got to do with it?" Dan muttered. "It's all one man's fault, and I have to find out why." "I have to find out why." You must talk, of course," said his mother calmly. "But don't forget that you are brothers." "Yes, I remember." "Don't worry about it. He could have been messing around and going to the bedroom where his older brother was asleep, sprawled out on the bed. In another situation, Dan would never have woken him up. But now, he just couldn't wait until morning. "Paul, wake up." "It isn't Lucy at all. It's Mary. And I think she's got a kid," he said. "And how do you know about the kid's name?" The boy looked at his brother, realizing that he had said too much. On the one hand, he wanted to protect his own man from deceivers, but on the other, telling the story of how he knew Mary. Paul wasn't going to. "Dan, let me not explain anything. Just trust me. This girl is no match for you." "Oh no," brother affectionately Dan spoke up. "That's not the way to do it. You're going to tell me everything about how you met Mary and how you ran away from her and how you ran away from her and how, knowing you were going to have a baby and pretending it wasn't any of your business." Dan wanted to hear the whole truth from his brother. Walking home, the man still harbored an illusion, thinking that maybe Dan didn't know that Mary had given birth to him. But now he understood his brother knew that he was growing a child's nose, and he didn't care. The right Dan just couldn't get it all in his head. "Okay," quietly Paul spoke up. "I'll tell you everything, but on the condition that you don't throw a tantrum and promise me that Mom and my wife won't find out about it." "All right," Dan nodded. He understood that his mother and father would be too worried if they knew the truth. And Dan wasn't going to ruin his brother's family either. After all, a child was going to be born there too. "You will be silent for a long time." Looking at his brother, Igor muttered, telling already. "Do not hurry me. I do not know where to start," Paul muttered. He looked confused. So Dan decided to help his older brother. "Let's start from the beginning. Where did you two meet? And how did you meet?" "We met at summer camp." Paul started his confession. "I was in my 3rd year there as a part-time worker. Money was tight, you know, but there's the sea. The food was good. They paid money and there were plenty of young counselors. Take your pick." Mary fell for me right away. I could see it in her eyes. She mostly followed me. Was I supposed to say no? Besides, getting her pregnant was not part of my plans. I wasn't the kind of guy who would get married and ruin his life over a baby. She could have gotten rid of it, but she didn't. She'd write me on social media and then she'd be all pushy about it. She almost ruined it for me then. Paul looked at his brother angrily. "Are you talking about Ellis now?" Dan spoke slowly, figuring out how to express his thoughts correctly. But when he realized there was no point in keeping it to himself, he spoke openly, unvarnished. "I never understood why you're with Ellis," Dan said with a sigh. "No, She's a pretty girl, of course, but she's kind of silly and soulless. She's always been in your company as long as I can remember, but you never paid any attention to her, and then you did. I was very surprised then. Paul grinned. I wasn't smart enough to understand why I started going out with her all of a sudden. Dan shrugged indefinitely. He did not understand why his brother was talking to him like that. Why was there so much anger and irritation in his voice? The more Dan talked to Dan, the more questions he had. There was no clarity, and it was so important for Dan to understand everything. Don't tell me it was the money. With squeamishness in his voice, Dan said. Paul smirked again, disappointed in his older brother. Let's just say I had a chance to make my own fortune. I was finishing my last year of college at the time, and her father helped me get a decent job. There's career advancement and a life without poverty. What would you have chosen? Especially since there wasn't much to choose from. I didn't love Ellis or Mary, and I don't think I've ever loved anyone in my life. It's not for nothing that they say one chooses the lesser of two evils. So I chose Ellis. But now I live my life without a care in the world. And then you told us that you were lucky. You won some kind of contest? Dan was surprised. What was I supposed to say? I wanted my parents to be proud, Paul said. I was flying with the wings. I had no idea what I was going to get out of it. A month later, my father Ellis called me and asked me how I was doing, and then he invited me to lunch. I was very surprised at the time. And over lunch he told me that Ellis was head over heels in love with me, that I could, in gratitude for my arranged fate, pay attention to her. But in a word, he made me a condition that either I marry his daughter or I'm out of the company, and there's no way I can get a job anywhere else. That's when I realized that you have to pay for everything in life, little brother. The men were silent. Dan could not believe that all this was happening in real life. He was very upright and thought Paul was the same way. But all the filth that came out in one evening so overwhelmed Igor that he was in a reel. Shocked. Why didn't you tell your parents? They would have helped. Dan, are you a fool or are you pretending? What could our parents have done? Pulling with Ella's father, the owner of factories, cars, steamboats? Aren't you exaggerating? Dan interrupted. Not that omnipotent. You're wrong, very quietly and angrily objected Paul. You have no idea what connections and friends my father-in-law had. I didn't know before, but I do now. Ellis knows about your conspiracy. Dan, you never cease to amaze me today, the older brother laughed. Of course she doesn't. She believes we're in love and for life. I'm used to her by now. I guess I feel good with her. There's just no fire, you know. It's hard to explain. We just live a quiet and peaceful life. But if it wasn't for her father, we wouldn't be together. That's for sure. Are you a coward? Suddenly Dan said. A man who can't take responsibility for his actions. I am ashamed. I am very ashamed of myself. Having said this, Dan left the room. It was quiet in the apartment. So, trying not to make noise, the man went out into the corridor and put on his jacket. Walked out of the apartment. He wanted to be alone, to calm down and think. He was too disappointed in his brothers too much. Mary sat on the floor, cradling her teddy bear and looking at the colorful lights that ran across the Christmas tree. The girl's soul was wistful. It was 4:00 before New Year's Eve, and Mary was trying to figure out what made her so sad. This whole year had been so much better than the last. Sam had hardly been sick at all. Mary was finally getting more or less a decent paycheck, and she could breathe easier. Mary was lying, though. She knew perfectly well the reason for her homesickness. It was Dan and his brother who had stirred up painful memories in her soul. When Mary ran away from Dan with a slap in the face, she really hoped that the man would disappear from her life and she would forget everything that happened as a bad dream. But it wasn't. The next day, Dan started calling, wanting to talk to Mary. The girl didn't pick up, and then put the number on a blacklist. But this did not make things easier on the soul. To take her mind off her sad thoughts a little, Mary looked at her son and asked, "What do you think Santa Claus will put under your Christmas tree?" Sam dreamed of a railroad. That toy, which appealed to the boy and was very expensive. Mary herself could not afford such a purchase, but she came to the aid of her faithful friend Katya, who added money. "Well, I will not give money for a gift, godson." Katya was indignant, adding the missing amount to her friend. In general, Mary anticipated her son's joy. But what Sam answered to a simple and seemingly simple question made the girl hurry up. "I want Daddy," emphasizing every word. The boy spoke. Daddy held out the girl. "But they don't put them under the Christmas tree." "It's a pity," sighed the child. "And so I want everyone in the kindergarten has a daddy, and I do not." Magoo had time to open her mouth to explain to her son about his father. The doorbell rang. "Let me see who's here and we'll talk," said Mary, looking at her son. "And who might that be?" She thoughtfully stretched out the girl near the door. She knew that Kristin now flew to Prague for vacation. Kristin had been raving about such a trip for a long time, and the boy fulfilled the dream of his beloved. And no one else could come to visit Mary and Sam. "Who is there?" Mary asked and looked into the eyes. "Santa Claus." A cheerful boss sounded from behind the door. "I did not order," Magoo said, not wanting to open the door. She was afraid Sam would see Santa Claus and think it was him. She had no money for an animator. Even the joyful man who could give Mary a discount as his own bent such a price that the girl's eye began to twitch. Mary only stepped away from the door. How did the bell ring again? Here's a stubborn from the pen and the door's ranted girl. "I did not order Santa Claus," spelled out Mary, looking at the man in the suit. "Let's talk." "Missing the beard a little," said Santa Claus, and Mary immediately recognized him. In front of the girl stood Dan. The costume of the New Year's Eve wizard suited him unusually well. It made Dan look like a real Santa Claus. But Mary couldn't buy that. "Go away," she said sternly. "I don't want to talk to you. Your show, I participated. We have nothing more to talk about. Magoo, you shouldn't do that. I understand that you're angry with her, but it has nothing to do with me. After all, it's not fair of you. It's not fair." Magoo groaned. "Yes, it isn't fair to deprive me of my contact with my nephew," Dan said. "Your nephew? I thought you doubted that I gave birth to my nephew. Get out, dishonest." Mary slammed the door in anger. "Mother, who was that?" Running out into the hallway, Sam asked. "The wrong door," Magoo answered. She was about to follow her son into the hall when the doorbell rang again. "I told you to leave." "You have the wrong door," shouted the girl angrily. "Who is it? Who is it? Who is it?" Walking up to the door, came right up to the door, asked Sam, "Who are you?" "Me, Santa Claus." Don's voice was heard from behind the door. "Mom, Mom, it's Santa Claus," the child shouted. "Why don't you open the door? Little uncle is just kidding." "It's not Santa Claus," said Magoo, looking at her son, and then turning to the door, said in a very stern voice, "Go away, otherwise I will call the police." Mary hoped that her words would scare Dan and he would back off. But he didn't. The doorbell rang again. The girl sighed, and Sam quickly ran to the door and asked who was there. "It's Santa Claus." "I've brought you presents. Your name is Sam." "And I know Sam," continued Dan at the door, realizing that he could only get into Mary's apartment through his nephew. "And I also know," Dan continued, "that you've been good this year listening to your mother, and that's why I brought you presents." Sam stood silent, holding his breath, and Mary was angry, determined to put the overworked Dan in his place. She swung the doors open. That was her mistake. Sam, seeing Santa Claus screaming, rushed toward him. "Santa Claus, the real mommy. He is real. He even knows my name. And you didn't want to let him in," said the boy, who was overwhelmed with emotion. "You go through," grabbing the sleeve of the coat of Santa Claus, said the boy. "My mother and I have potatoes and delicious layered. Come on in, we'll treat you." Mary sighed heavily, realizing that now she would not be able to put out Dan. And the man cheerfully winked at her, walked over, chatting to the table. As much as Mary tried to show her displeasure and be stern, she failed. The girl couldn't watch Dan play with her son without smiling. The uncle and his nephew quickly found common ground. Sam unashamedly and very diligently told Santa Claus a rhyme, and when he received a gift from the good wizard, the big designer squealed with happiness. "Well now, let Mommy close her eyes and put her palms up. I also have a gift for Mom," said Igor, looking at Mary. "Thank you, that's all right," quietly replied the girl, averting her eyes. "I'm a big girl, and big girls do not give gifts," grinned Santa Claus. "It seems to me that it is very important for girls, regardless of their age, to receive presents, to close their eyes and put up their hands." "No," shook his head and stubbornly said, "Mary." And then Sam intervened. "Mom, why are you so mean?" "With Santa Claus cannot argue. He's a magician. Close your eyes and put your hands up, but please. Otherwise Santa Claus will not come to us anymore." Sam whispered the last phrase into Mary's ear in a frightened voice. Mary had no choice but to comply with his son's requests. She squeezed her eyes shut and stretched her folded palms forward. After a couple of seconds, something cold touched her skin. Opening her eyes, Mary saw a bracelet with a circular pendant dangling from it. The family was engraved on the smooth. "You are my family now," quietly Dan muttered, and Mary wiped away the tears that had accumulated. The rest of the evening passed in a strange atmosphere. On the one hand, everything was fine. Dan was still in his Santa Claus costume, playing with Sam at the constructor. The boy looked absolutely happy. Every now and then he ran up to Mary. Said, "Mom, we have a real Santa Claus on a visit." Mary, in response, lost her balance and kissed her son, who immediately ran to play. But on the other hand, she was homesick. She was very much afraid that as soon as the chime struck 00, the fairy tale would end. Santa Claus would turn back into Dan, who had his own life, and she would become a single mother with a child who was so lacking in male companionship. The clock showed 11:45 p.m., when, exhausted by emotion and sudden happiness, Sam fell asleep right on the floor next to the constructor, which brought him a real Santa Claus. "Let me move him to bed," said Dan quietly, looking at Mary. She nodded silently, and the man picked up his sleeping nephew and carried him into the room. Sam didn't even wake up, just smiled something, and the world caught up with us, ending up in bed. The man covered the boy with a blanket and quietly walked out. "I'm going to go with a sad look at Mary," Dan muttered. The girl noisily sucked in air, exhaled and closed her eyes and said, "Leave me alone. Soon the chimes will chime. Soon the new year. You won't make it home in time." Having said that, Mary opened her eyes and looked at Dan. He said nothing. He stood silent, keeping his beautiful eyes on Meg, and then he stepped forward and kissed her, very carefully so as not to scare her away. Mary didn't push him away. She responded to the kiss with all the tenderness she was capable of, and then deflected a little, mumbling, "Let's go into the hall. The president is about to start talking." Dan nodded with a smile and, taking Mary by the hand, went into the hall, taking her with him. And so they sat up all night, holding hands and talking. And in the morning, when Sam woke up and saw Dan, he whispered, "It had come true. My wish had come true. Just the kind of daddy I wanted." Mary only smiled, and Dan hugged the child tightly and held him close to him. Dan and Mary hid the Santa Claus costume securely, not wanting Sam to find it. They wanted the boy to believe in a miracle for as long as possible.